It was a typical summer day. People went about their business, grocery shopping, running errands, meeting friends, when suddenly the air shifted. On the news, an emergency broadcast flashed across every screen. A chilling message echoed, "The end is near." The world paused, unsure if this was real or just another hoax. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just another vague doomsday prediction from some fringe group or conspiracy theorist. This one came from a person who had predicted every major catastrophe in history. This prediction? The end of the world. On this very day. People scrambled, preparations were made, churches were packed, bunkers were stocked, phones rang non-stop, and countless lives were altered in a matter of hours. Everyone had one thing on their mind. Would this be the moment everything changed? But then, nothing. No massive earthquakes, no deadly floods, no fiery skies. The sun set that night, just like every other night before it. The apocalypse hadn't arrived, and life went on. But who was this person? And why had their prediction, one that seemed to have the weight of truth, ended up as just another failed prophecy? The man behind the prophecy was a self-proclaimed prophet, a mysterious figure who had emerged from the shadows of history with a track record of seemingly accurate predictions. He had warned the world about disasters before. His name was known, but his true identity remained a riddle. Was he simply lucky, or did he have some hidden knowledge? His story began decades earlier in a small, obscure town, known only to a handful of believers. His cult-like following grew as word spread of his uncanny ability to predict everything from stock market crashes to natural disasters. He was the talk of underground forums and late-night radio shows, but most people dismissed him as a crackpot. Then one day, he announced something that caught the attention of millions. He predicted the end of the world, not in some distant future, but in mere months. And according to his cryptic messages, the signs were already all around them. For weeks, the world was transfixed. Governments, scientists, and religious leaders weighed in. Some laughed it off as nonsense. Others took it more seriously. After all, hadn't there been other so-called prophets who had predicted disaster before? And hadn't they too been proven wrong? Yet, despite the skepticism, something about this prediction felt different. The man's warnings didn't follow the usual doomsday script. This time, the details were unsettlingly specific. He named dates, locations, and even described unusual celestial events. There were patterns that seemed to align with global unrest, wars, climate change, and political chaos. As the deadline drew nearer, panic set in. The media, hungry for a story, broadcasted every update. People flocked to prepare. Some moved into bunkers, others sold everything they had. And on the eve of the predicted doomsday, there was an eerie tension in the air. Everyone was waiting for the impossible to happen. But then, when the moment arrived, there was no cataclysm. The world didn't end. The sun rose and life continued. People felt relieved, but also uneasy. Had they been duped? The man's prediction was just another failed doomsday prophecy. Another case of people grasping at straws, hoping for answers in an uncertain world. But while the prediction had failed, it did something more. It exposed a deeper truth about the human psyche. And yet, this wasn't the first or the last failed prediction of its kind. Throughout history, there have been countless doomsday predictions, each more convincing than the last. But for every failed prophecy, another one would rise, and another wave of panic would follow. Why do these predictions continue to capture our imaginations? Why do we fall for them over and over again? As we'll see in this video, the strange stories of apocalyptic predictions that never came true are not just tales of failed foresight, they're reflections of our deepest fears, and a reminder that even in the face of the most extreme predictions, we're still searching for meaning in a world that often doesn't make sense. Weeks after the failed doomsday prediction, something strange began to unfold. It wasn't just the typical aftershock of a failed prophecy. It was something far more unsettling. The man who had predicted the end of the world had disappeared. At first, no one thought much of it. Prophets and clairvoyants often vanished after their predictions failed. Some went into hiding, others found new, less risky avenues for their wisdom. But as time passed, it became clear that this disappearance wasn't ordinary. The man hadn't simply gone into seclusion, he had disappeared in a way that didn't make sense. He had left behind a collection of bizarre items that only deepened the mystery. On his desk, police found a series of hand-drawn maps, each one depicting strange symbols and locations, none of which seemed to correlate with anything in the known world. At the center of these maps was a location he had frequently mentioned in his final predictions, a small, uncharted island off the coast of Alaska. But this island didn't appear on any maps. It was as if it didn't exist at all. Adding to the confusion, witnesses reported seeing him just days before his disappearance, meeting with an unknown figure in a dimly lit alley. No one knew who the figure was. The person had been wearing a large hood, and their face was never seen. Was it someone connected to the prophecy, or was it an entirely different mystery altogether? The contradictions piled up. The last recorded interview with the man, just days before the so-called apocalypse, had shown him calm, collected, almost detached. He spoke as though he had already known the outcome, that the prediction would fail. Yet there was something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke that didn't add up. Was he relieved that the world didn't end? Or did he know something more that the public didn't? As the days stretched on, more peculiar events unfolded. The supposed signs of the apocalypse that he had predicted, strange celestial alignments, unexplained weather patterns, hadn't stopped. The weather became increasingly erratic. Hurricanes, tornadoes, and heat waves struck in unusual patterns. Was it just coincidence, or was something still at play? Something no one could fully understand. The more the world tried to move on from the failed prophecy, the more unanswered questions lingered. Why had he predicted such specific events? Why had he suddenly disappeared without a trace? Was it possible that the prophecy hadn't been about the end of the world at all, but rather the beginning of something far more terrifying? As Johann lifted the lid of the box, a pulse of cold shot through the room. The frost on the windows grew thicker, and the air turned so frigid it felt like ice was creeping beneath his skin. Inside the box was a small glowing crystal, radiating an eerie light. The moment his fingers brushed it, the world around him began to warp. The walls distorted, and the ground trembled as though the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. Johann's heart raced. He realized with terrifying clarity he had unlocked something far greater than he could ever understand. The lid lifted with an audible click, and a strange hum filled the air, vibrating through Johann's chest. Inside the box, nestled in soft glowing fabric, was a small crystal. It was translucent, but with colors that danced and shifted like liquid light. The crystal seemed alive, moving, pulsing with an energy Johann couldn't explain. He reached for it cautiously, but as his fingers touched it, everything changed. The cottage around him vanished. The ground beneath his feet disappeared. Johann was no longer in his home. The world he had known faded, replaced by a cold, desolate landscape. A storm raged in the distance, and the sky was an unsettling shade of violet, casting an eerie glow over everything. Before he could process what was happening, a voice spoke, deep and resonant, echoing in his mind. "The fabric is thinning." Johann gasped and looked around, but there was no one there. His head spun, and a deep sense of dread settled in his chest. The voice continued, no longer a whisper, but a command. "You have opened the door, Johann. You have crossed the threshold. There is no going back." The ground beneath him trembled once again, and the storm in the distance grew closer. A massive shadow loomed in the darkening sky, and Johann's breath caught in his throat. What was that? Something massive, something ancient was approaching. With no time to think, Johann ran, and as he looked up, he realized the truth. The end wasn't over. It had just begun. Want more? Subscribe now for the next chapter of this mysterious journey.